Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. We got a really interesting one today, transracial. It's a word that honestly I've been seeing more and more, and I'm not really sure what it means. So that's why we're here today, to break it all down. Where does it come from? What does it mean? All that jazz. And to help me, I've got some really interesting sources here. Got some Wikipedia entries on ethnicity, genome editing, and race. Even got a Reddit thread where people are talking about Michael Jackson's racial identity. Oh, and of course a TikTok video exploring different, perspectives on race.
Wow, yeah. It seems like we've got a pretty diverse set of sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, and it kind of feels like we need a dictionary just to get started.
Well, I think that just shows how layered and nuanced this whole topic is. I mean, transracial is a pretty new term, and as we'll see, it really sits at this crossroads of biology, culture, and even personal identity.
Okay, so where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, before we get into the whole transracial thing, maybe it's helpful to just take a step back and look at the idea of ethnicity. You shared a Wikipedia entry on that, right?
Yeah, I thought that might be a good place to start, but honestly, I kind of skimmed it. There was a lot of anthropology jargon in there. What
Yeah.
was the main takeaway there?
Well, the main point is that ethnic identity is dynamic and multifaceted. It's not like this fixed, unchanging thing. Like, for example, the anthropologist Joan Vincent describes ethnic boundaries as having this mercurial character.
Mercurial, so they change a lot.
Yeah, exactly. They shift and adapt over time.
So, it's not as simple as just checking a box on a form.
Right, exactly. And to add to that, the Wikipedia entry even quotes another anthropologist, Ronald Cohen, who says that these ethnic boundaries can actually be adjusted based on political needs.
Oh, wow. So it's all very strategic.
It really can be.
That makes me think about historical examples of assimilation or acculturation.
Mm.
Like how, immigrant groups might gradually adopt the culture of their new home over time. It seems like there's a long history of people moving between these different ethnicities in all sorts of ways.
Absolutely. And that's kind of where things start to get complicated when we try to apply this label transracial. Because while ethnicity might be fluid, race adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Right. And speaking of complexity, we have this Reddit thread about Michael Jackson and his changing appearance over the years. I mean, people were seriously debating whether he was actually trying to become white.
Yeah, it's a really sensitive and tricky conversation to have, especially considering that he was actually diagnosed with vitiligo.
That's the skin condition, right?
Yeah, it causes a loss of pigmentation in the skin. But even with that diagnosis, his transformation really brought up all these questions about racial identity and even the idea of passing as a different race.
Yeah, it seems like that whole debate gets to the core of what transracial is trying to deal with, right? Can you actually choose your race like some people choose their gender?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And it's one that often leads to a lot of misunderstanding and even controversy. But before we dive into that, I think it's super important to talk about a really common misconception about race. Race, as we understand it, socially, doesn't actually have a biological basis.
Wait, really? But we talk about all these different races all the time. What do you mean it's not biological?
So the Wikipedia entry on race, human categorization, is actually really clear on this point. It explains that while there are certainly physical variations between different human populations, these variations don't match up with those rigid racial categories that we've created. Human genetic diversity is actually more like a gradient than these separate boxes. Scientists call it clinal variation.
Okay, so there's not a single gene that makes someone black or white or Asian.
Exactly. There's no scientific basis for saying, this person belongs to this race because of their DNA. Race is a social construct, which basically means that it's a category that we created based on perceived differences, not biological ones.
Whoa, okay. So if it's not biological, does that mean it's just made up?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't really matter?
Well, it's definitely not made up in the sense that it doesn't have real world consequences. I mean, race has literally shaped our history, our laws, even just our everyday social interactions. It has a huge impact on people's lives. But what we need to recognize is that the categories themselves are fluid and based on social perception rather than these, fixed biological traits.
Okay, so this is making my head spin a little bit. So we've got ethnicity, which can be fluid, and then we have race, which is a social construct.
Right.
So where does this transracial idea fit into all of this?
Well, that's the puzzle that we're trying to solve here. And to make things even more interesting, you also included a Wikipedia entry about genome editing.
Yeah, that one was a little bit of a wild card. I stumbled across it while I was researching this whole topic, and I thought it, adds another layer to the conversation.
Oh, it definitely does. So techniques like MGE, which stands for Multiplex Automated Genome Engineering, can actually edit up to 50 different spots in the genome simultaneously.
50. Wow.
Yeah, and while it's not currently being used to change, like, racial characteristics, it does bring up a really interesting hypothetical question.
Are we talking like designer babies here? Could someone actually edit their genes to look like a different race? That's like straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It's definitely not a reality yet, but it's a thought experiment that's worth considering. Like, what if we could alter our physical appearance to align with a different racial group? Would that actually make us transracial?
Whoa, that is a very thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
And it feels like we're kind of venturing into uncharted territory here.
We are, and I think that's why this whole topic is so fascinating. It really forces us to confront all these deeply held beliefs that we have about race and identity.
So to recap, we've talked about ethnicity, the fact that there isn't a biological basis for race, and even this crazy potential for technology to, like, alter our physical traits. But we still haven't really pinned down what transracial actually means.
You're right. And to do that, I think we need to look at how the term is being used and debated in different contexts. And I think the most common one, and probably the least controversial, is transracial adoption.
Right, where a child of one race is adopted by parents of a different race.
Exactly. But even in that context, there are a lot of complexities and questions that come up about cultural identity, belonging, and how to navigate a world where race, even if it is a social construct, has very real consequences.
It does feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface here. There's so much more to unpack about transracial and what it implies about how we understand race as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. And to really get to the heart of the matter, I think we need to dive into those arguments for and against the idea of transracial identity beyond adoption. That's where things get really interesting. So, picking up where we left off, I think it's fair to say that this whole idea of transracial identity is really forcing us to confront some pretty deep-seated beliefs about race. It challenges us to think about whether race is something that's fixed and inherent or if it's something more fluid and, changeable.
It almost feels like this term is making us question the very foundation of how we categorize people, which can be kind of unsettling.
Right.
So where do people even stand on this? Are there clear-cut arguments for and against this transracial identity?
Well, I think it's safe to say that there are some very strong opinions on both sides of this issue. And I think it's important to try to understand the nuances of each perspective. So on the one hand, you have those who believe that transracial identity is possible and should be acknowledged.
So are they saying that, if someone strongly feels that they belong to a different racial group, that they should just be able to claim that identity?
Essentially, yes. The argument often centers around the concept of self-identification, and they might point to examples like Rachel Dolezal, who was a white woman who presented herself as black for years.
Oh, yeah, I read that.
Or they might point to individuals who have undergone significant physical transformations, like surgery or skin lightening procedures, to align themselves with a different race.
But wouldn't that be, disregarding the actual lived experiences of people who genuinely belong to that racial group? It just doesn't seem right that you can just choose to be Black or Asian or Hispanic without having lived with the history and the social implications of those identities.
And that's exactly the point raised by those who reject the whole idea of transracial identity.
Yeah.
They argue that race isn't just a matter of personal feeling or choice. It's about, shared ancestry, cultural heritage, and importantly, how one is perceived and treated by society based on their race.
Yeah, it's kind of like saying, I identify as Italian, but having absolute no knowledge of Italian culture, language, or history. You're missing that depth of what it actually means to belong to that group.
Exactly. And I think it becomes even more problematic when you consider, the power dynamics involved. Race and racism have shaped our world in really profound ways, leading to systemic inequalities and discrimination. And so to just claim a racial identity without acknowledging, the struggles and injustices faced by that group can be seen as incredibly, appropriative and even insensitive.
So it sounds like the critics are saying that transracial identity is basically about, cherry-picking the appealing aspects of a racial group
Yeah.
without actually understanding or experiencing the challenges that come with it.
That's definitely one of the key arguments against it. They also point out that allowing people to just choose their race could actually undermine efforts to address things like racial inequality and to dismantle systemic racism.
I'm not sure I follow that. How would that make it harder to fight racism?
Well, if race becomes solely based on self-identification, it could really blur the lines between authentic lived experiences and, performative gestures. It can make it really difficult to track and address those disparities based on race if anyone can just claim any racial identity they want. Imagine, like, someone benefiting from affirmative action policies that are meant to support historically marginalized groups while not having actually experienced that marginalization themselves.
Okay, yeah. Now that you explain it that way, I can definitely see how that could be a problem. It's like saying that anyone can choose to be a woman, even if they haven't experienced the unique challenges of being female in our society.
That's a great analogy because the point is that race, much like gender, carries with it this complex history of social and political implications that can't really be separated from individual identity.
This whole debate is really highlighting just how tangled these concepts of race and identity truly are. We have these strong arguments on both sides, respecting self-identification versus acknowledging the complexities of race and the potential harm in oversimplifying it.
It really is a genuine dilemma, and I think that's why defining transracial remains such a challenge. There's no, easy or straightforward answer, and any attempt to define it needs to carefully consider the ethical and social implications involved. Because, it's not just a philosophical debate, it really touches on these real-world issues of equality, justice, and belonging.
So we're back to square one. What does it actually mean to be transracial? Is it only about how someone identifies, or is there something more to it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it's really important to remember that there's no, one-size-fits-all answer. Each individual's journey with racial identity is unique and is shaped by this very complex web of personal, social, and historical factors. I think we really need to avoid making sweeping judgments or generalizations here.
I understand that, but it still feels like we're kind of dancing around a definition.
Yeah.
Is there any, common ground or any shared understanding when people use this term?
Well, I think it's safe to say that those who claim a transracial identity are often expressing a very deep desire for, belonging or connection with a particular racial group.
It's like they're seeking this sense of identity or community that they feel is missing from their own lives.
Yeah.
And while that desire is totally understandable, we can't ignore the potential for harm in validating claims that might actually erase or minimize the experiences of those who genuinely belong to that racial group.
Right, exactly. I think empathy and understanding are absolutely crucial, but we need to be really mindful of the power dynamics at play here and avoid reinforcing those harmful stereotypes or generalizations.
It feels like there's a really important distinction here between, appreciating and respecting a culture and actually claiming membership in a racial group. Like, you can love Italian food and study Italian art without claiming to be Italian.
Right. Exactly. Appreciation and respect are super important, but they don't necessarily equate to lived experience and shared history. And when it comes to race, those factors carry a lot of weight in shaping someone's identity and their understanding of the world.
Okay, so we've explored all these different perspectives and angles, but it still feels like we're wrestling with this very elusive concept. If we can't really define transracial, how do we even start to move forward with this whole conversation?
Well, I think that's where the real work begins. We need to move beyond those simplistic labels and engage in, open and honest dialogue about these issues, race, identity, and belonging. And I think that requires us to actually listen to those diverse voices, to challenge our own biases, and to approach the conversation with a lot of humility and a willingness to learn.
That sounds pretty challenging. But I can see how, shutting down the conversation entirely or dismissing people's experiences wouldn't really help anyone. It seems like we need to actually grapple with the complexities here rather than trying to force these easy answers.
Absolutely. And remember, this is still a relatively new and evolving concept. The language that we use to talk about race and identity is constantly changing as we learn more about ourselves and each other.
So maybe the key is to actually shift our focus away from trying to find a definitive answer and instead explore those deeper questions of, belonging, connection, and how we navigate those complexities of identity in a world where race continues to hold so much power.
That's a really thoughtful approach. And as we continue to explore these issues, I think we'll find that there are new insights and understandings emerging that will help us better address the challenges and opportunities presented by this whole evolving concept of transracial.
This deep dive has been like a whirlwind of information and different
Oh.
perspectives. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface here. Are we ready to move into that final part of our exploration?
Absolutely. I think we've laid the groundwork. Now it's time to really delve into the implications of transracial in different contexts and see what lessons we can take away for the future.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into transracial. And wow, we've covered a lot of ground. From the fluidity of ethnicity to the social construction of race. It's It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it's definitely a multi-layered issue, and I
Mhm.
think it really does challenge a lot of our assumptions about identity and belonging. But, that's what makes these conversations so important. They kind of push us to think critically and consider those different perspectives.
So where do we even go from here? We've explored all these arguments, these different perspectives, but it still feels like we have this big question mark hanging over this whole idea of transracial. How do we move from, theory to actual real-world applications and implications?
That's a really great question. And I think it helps to remember that while the term transracial might be relatively new, the questions that it brings up about race and identity have been around for centuries. Think about the history of human migration, intermarriage, cultural exchange. These are all instances where people have kind of, crossed racial boundaries in different ways.
Yeah, you're right. The human story is full of these complex interactions that just defy simple categorization. But the fact that we're still struggling to even define transracial just shows how deeply ingrained the concept of race is in our thinking, right?
Absolutely. And that's why this conversation is so crucial. It forces us to confront those ingrained beliefs and ask ourselves, do they still hold up in today's world?
Okay, so let's get practical here. What are the real-world implications of this transracial debate? Like, where is it actually showing up in our lives?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, transracial adoption is probably the most common and well-established context where this term transracial is used. But even there, it's not without its controversies.
Right, we see those different perspectives playing out. Some emphasizing the importance of a child's racial and cultural heritage, while others are saying, hey, finding a loving home is what matters most, regardless of race.
Exactly. There's no easy answer. And each situation really requires careful consideration of what's truly best for that child. But even beyond adoption, we're seeing these transracial conversations come up in other areas as well.
Like cultural appropriation. That seems to be such a hot button issue these days.
Yeah.
When someone from one culture adopts elements of another culture, it can raise all sorts of questions about respect, authenticity, even those power dynamics that we talked about.
Yeah, you're really hitting on a key point there. Cultural exchange can be a really beautiful thing, but I think it's so important to approach it with sensitivity and awareness. We need to be mindful of the historical context, any power imbalances that might exist, and the potential for harm if we're not careful.
It's kind of like that saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. It's about trying to understand another person's perspective and experience before making judgments or borrowing from their culture.
That's it, that empathy and understanding are essential. And I think education is key here as well. The more we learn about different cultures and perspectives, the better equipped we are to actually engage in these conversations respectfully.
And then there's that whole mind-blowing world of technology. Like
Yeah.
we briefly talked about genome editing and that hypothetical possibility of, altering our physical traits to match a different race.
Mm.
It still feels very sci-fi to me.
It does, doesn't it? But it raises some really profound ethical questions about the future of race and identity. If we could literally change our appearance to match a different racial group, would that actually change who we are? Would that make us, transracial? Or would it just be another form of self-expression, like getting a tattoo or changing our hairstyle?
I don't know if we have the answers to those questions yet,
No.
but it's definitely a reminder that these concepts are fluid and they're constantly evolving.
And it highlights how our understanding of race is so intertwined with, technology, culture, and our own individual choices.
So after all of this unpacking and exploring, where does this leave us? What's the key takeaway for our listeners who are trying to wrap their heads around all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that transracial is not this simple label or category that you can just slap on someone. It's complex, it's multifaceted, and it really challenges us to, confront our assumptions about race, identity, and belonging. There's no easy definition, no easy answer.
It seems like the more we try to define it, the more nuanced it actually becomes.
Exactly. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means we're engaging in a deeper, more meaningful conversation about these really important issues.
So instead of trying to find that one perfect definition, maybe the goal is to just keep asking questions, challenging our own biases, and being open to learning from all these different perspectives.
I couldn't agree more. I think the conversation about transracial is just getting started, and it's up to all of us to kind of shape its direction in a thoughtful and respectful way.
Well, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive. I know I've got a lot to think about after this whole exploration of transracial. How about you? What's resonating with you after all of this?
For me, it's that realization that while race may be a social construct, it has this very real and tangible impact on all of our lives. And how we choose to navigate all of these complexities, individually and as a society, it will shape our future. And that's a powerful thought.
It is. Well, thanks for joining me on this journey into the world of transracial. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.